maybe I can quickly go through some decks that I put together, right? Again, I mean, if you are looking at, let's see, click on present. So before we start on single sign-on, right? Like, what is it exactly that that is part of the single sign-on solution? So when we talk about a single sign-on, the use cases here are that the enterprise application security needs, they revolve around two main things, right? So you are trying to establish who that user is. So let's say a user is trying to access an application, right? So you are trying to establish that. And then that's your authentication side of it. And then you have the authorization part of it, right? So that user, whoever you have authenticated, that user needs access to, let's say, a set of application, right? So let's say a user needs only access, read access to a particular side of the application, and a different user needs a write access to a different side of the application, right? So that's your authorization. So typically that is what you're trying to establish. You are trying to establish who and what. And in a traditional enterprise identity solution, identity management, right? How is it done? The way it is done is that typically you would have an LDAP directory. That's where your all your enterprise users information is stored. So all your applications, right? How do they interact with each other? And that is typically done through an identity management system. So I mean, my background has been with Oracle. I have more than 12 years of experience working at Oracle. And at Oracle, the way this was done was you would have an LDAP directory called Oracle Unified Directory. And your applications, the way they communicate, right, the messages was done through SAML, right? So that's your enterprise solution on the left side. And towards the beyond that, right, typically your enterprise will also need to communicate with your partners as well as some other cloud websites, right? And the way that you try to do that is through again SAML and OIDC. So those are the protocols that you normally use, and that's your traditional way of doing things. So that is, so when we were talking about that federation, right? Like when you're trying to connect to a partner or when you're trying to connect to a cloud website, that federation is done using these two protocols mainly. So SAML is a protocol where the way the communication is done is XML over HTTPS. But then, I mean, the newer version, the new protocol that is more popular nowadays is this OpenID Connect. So the way that is done is JSON over HTTPS. So when you are actually exchanging identity information across domains, right? What is it that you are exchanging? So typically, what you exchange is the attributes, right? So let's say a email, phone number, and address. That is you are trying to exchange, and then memberships, right? Group membership. So what is it that they have access to? So that is what you are exchanging as part of your identity federation. So that's from an user point of view. So there are two use cases here. So typically, you're trying to establish who and what on users' behalf. That's what I spoke earlier. But then your applications also need to talk to each other, right? So you need to be able to establish this who and what on applications' behalf as well. So those are the use cases that you kind of address in terms of enterprise API security needs. So the way you do that is again through something called OAuth 2. So OAuth 2 and API security, it's a protocol that was designed to establish this who and what on both on terms of user as well as application, right? So when we do this, right, when we do this delegated authorization protocol, there are essentially 4 actors. So what is an actor? So let's say I'm trying to sign up to Stack Overflow for the first time, right? So that's me as a user trying to access an application called Stack Overflow, right? And Stack Overflow, instead of having a sign up page where, nowadays pretty much a lot of websites offer you an option to sign in with the identity providers such as Google and Facebook. So instead of the user authentication, they can, directly go to Stack Overflow, right? Like, let me show you. So if I go to Stack Overflow, and if I'm trying to set up a new account, right? So that's me as a user trying to access an application called Stack Overflow. That's my second actor. And here I can have a third actor called, which is an authorization server. In this case, the authorization server could be a Google or Facebook. So what they are doing here is that they are asking me to provide my username and password. Once I do that, they can do a two-factor authentication where they would actually send me a token where if I say yes on my phone right now, so it takes me back and let me access. So the Stack Overflow is now able to create an account using my user information back from Google. So as you can see, that the protocol here is OAuth. If you look in the URL itself. So that's typically how it is done. So OAuth is what is providing this single sign-on capabilities in terms of um, um, authorization server and resource server. So if you understand the key actors, there is a user, application, API, the resource server, and an authorization server. So to demo this in terms of our products, right? So what I have done, I actually deployed an application called Freddy's Barbecue Market. So if you are familiar with this House of Cards show, right? So Frank Underwood, who is this um, senator, greedy senator, turns out to be a VP, and then he becomes a president. But he frequents a restaurant called Freddy's Barbecue. So kind of that application that I have here. So I have a portal where, so let's say Frank Underwood wants to, as a user, right? If he goes and let's say, so if I log into my application, so I have this customer portal.cfapps.io. That's my application. So that's me as a user trying to access an application called customer portal. So the moment I do that, right? So what this is doing, I have configured single sign-on so that I'm taken to a login page where it will ask for my user credentials. So if I enter my user credentials, so what it does is it takes me to the page where I can actually look at the menu and place an order. So with this user, so as you can see, I have access to order a full rack of ribs or half a rack. I mean, Frank Underwood is a greedy person, so we'll say 5 in terms of quantity. So what as a user, Frank, he can actually look at the order that he just placed, and that's about it. So that's the access that he has. And if I look at the access token, right? I mean, if I want to, so what I did here is that I did a dump of a token. So what exactly was happening was that, so this is the raw token. This is how it would normally look inside of a browser. But if I actually decode this, so if I decode the token itself, the token, what it has is that it has some of the key attributes. So what it is doing, the authorization server, it has returned, so it has authenticated that user exists in the database, in my user directory. It could be an LDAP directory or my internal store. And then instead of providing the credentials back to the application, what it does is it returns a token. So this is the token that it has returned. So within the token, what it has is it has some key attributes. That it has username, email, and then it also has something called what we call as a scope. So this is what the resource config is doing. It is actually telling this particular user he can read the menu and he can order in the page itself, but he cannot do more. So he does not have access to admin rights to the order itself, and he does not have admin rights to the menu itself. So that's kind of a view from a user point of view. Now let's say if I am an administrator, right? So in the TV series, the person who owns that restaurant, his name is Freddie Hayes. So what he does is, if I log in now as Freddie, right? So again, the same thing. So the single sign-on is taking me to a login page where I can actually so again, I mean, the user exists in the database, and then what it does is it takes me back to the resource server, and then based on the privileges that I have, it will let me log in, and it's Freddie. So now I'm logged in as Freddie, right? So Freddie has access so that he can actually look at what are the orders that was placed. So he can see that Frank Underwood, Frank at whitehouse.gov, he placed an order for a full rack of ribs, 5 quantity, right? So he can go ahead and close this order. So he has the privilege to do that. So that's what I have given the access rights to that user. And as an administrator to this portal, he can go ahead and edit, right? So if he wants to change the price from $30 to $35, he can do that. And if I go back here, right? If I look at the access token that this person is seeing, so again, the raw token, so typically this is what you would see, but I am doing a dump on the token itself. So again, as you can see, the token itself, what it does is it gives out some key attributes. It gives out username, email, auth, and so on. And it uses this RSA security signature. And if you look at the scope, right? So the scope that I have defined for user Freddie is that he's an admin, as well as he has a read and write to the menu itself. So that's how you control so authorization and authentication. So let me close that, and let me show you this in terms of how this is actually done. So again, to reiterate, right? So what I was just talking about. So resource owner is the user. So he's trying to access an application. In this case, it was Freddy's Barbecue's website. And the moment he tried to access the application, I have a login page that the application sent me back to. So once that user entered the username and password, so the next step was it went to an authorization server. And authorization server, this could be an this is where this is an identity provider, right? So authorization server, what it does is it will tell you, okay, once the user has entered his username and password, it validates, okay, this user exists in my database. So it responds to the application with an authorization code. And then what happens next is that the application exchanges that code with the client credentials for a token. And authorization to server, what it did, it actually sent a token back. And I was showing you how the token looks itself. So the token, once you have the token, right? Now, like, you are authorized, and then now I need to be able, you are authenticated. Now the application goes to the resource server and then asks for, depending on the user, right? Whether it was Frank or Freddie, I get from the resource server the privileges that I have access to, the access control, and gets back to the sense resource. So that's how the exchange happens within OAuth. So you typically have this four different actors: resource owner, application client, and authorization server, and resource server. And it is very secured. This flow is very secure, right? Like nowhere in here. So authorization server never gives you a credentials back to the application. It only sends a token back. So he never knows, the application never knows the credentials of the user itself. And the user itself does not actually, so the token actually happens between the application and the authorization server itself. So the owner has nothing to do with it, right? So this kind of a flow is very secure. And if you look at the token itself, right, like I was showing you, so the token itself, what does it have? The encoded token has a, if you decode it, you have a header information and the payload data, and the signature itself, right? Like it uses this SHA-256 RSA 256 signature, so it's very secure as well. That's how you would, I mean, if you have a user involved in the communication, that's how it happens. But your application to application communication, how does that happen? Again, it happens the same way, only that you do not have a user involved. So the application again sends a credentials, and then the authorization sends a token. And once you have that authentication done, then you do the authorization with the resource server. Any questions here before I jump on to the next slide so far?
So Tej, great presentation. The last two examples that you gave, the previous one, you would characterize that as a three-legged OAuth scenario. And then the last one that you just showed after that, that's the two-legged one. Is that correct?
Yes. So this one was two-legged in terms of there is no user. So this is your API to API communication. So application to application communication that is happening. So your microservices are communicating without the user, right? So that's the same flow compared to this one. So here you have a resource owner user that is communicating with the application, and the application is doing authorization and then goes to the resource server and then returns back.
Thanks.
Sure. If I have to talk about, so between all these protocols that I was just talking about, LDAP, SAML, OAuth, the LDAP was pretty, I mean, LDAP protocol was the older protocol. LDAP was pretty much used for only storing user information. And it was not distributed, and single sign-on capabilities does not exist within LDAP itself. The way to address that was done through SAML. SAML is again is a protocol that is distributed, and it provides you this single sign-on capabilities. But then there are some limitations with SAML as well. It does not support non-browser interaction, and it's not essentially intended for service-to-service API calls. You can actually do it. I mean, when I was working at Oracle, right, the way you do that is through SOAP web services and then use SAML. And then, I mean, it was a complex and nightmare configuration that you have to do to get this working. So essentially, SAML was not meant for that. So the ideal solution is OAuth and OIDC. This is the latest protocols that is cloud native. So it is distributed. It provides you single sign-on capabilities, and then it is intended for service-to-service APIs. So this is the latest protocols that normally everyone is using these days, OAuth. So besides that, right, like let me quickly show you in terms of setting this up. Single sign-on, if I go here, right, so I was telling you the essential component here is get this single sign-on from the tile, right? So what we have is we have a free plan here. So for my applications, what I have done for my applications, I have made sure that like I bound my applications to this single sign-on service. So once I do that, right, so I have two different dashboards that I get. So the first dashboard I see is this operator dashboard. So with our plan, if I look here, right, so both Claude and I have access to this, but let me know if you need access to it. I'll send an email. So here, right, so with this operator, I can configure multiple identity providers. So in this demo that I just showed, I was using the internal UAA store. Here, so what I am doing is I actually created two different users. I created a user called Frank Underwood as well as Freddie. So if I look at Frank, right, so within Frank Underwood, I gave him permissions. So my applications had something called menu. Within the application, I gave him menu read and the order read. So this is for Frank Underwood. And Freddie Hayes, what I did for him is if you look at my permissions, right, I gave him the read and write access on the menu itself, and the order, I gave him the admin rights. So that's from an operator's dashboard point of view. So the identity providers, I mean, in this case, I was using UAA, our internal user store. But if I have to do this kind of a demo for, I mean, pretty much every enterprise will have their own identity solution. You cannot force them to come up, use something that we have to offer. They will have their own identity provider. And we do support access to those identity providers. So we do support access through LDAP. And we also support SAML 2 as well as OpenID Connect that I was talking about, those three protocols that I was talking about. You can actually configure that. And the documentation, I mean, if I have to look at the documentation, right? So there is a pretty good documentation in terms of how do you configure for, let me see, for Active Directory. Active Directory uses LDAP. Azure Active Directory, they have a SAML integration guide, but they also have OIDC. It supports both SAML as well as OIDC. Google has their identity provider supports OIDC, and Okta integration guide also uses SAML. So what I was thinking I will do as a follow-up after this, right? So setting this up was, I mean, it's straightforward, but it took me some time. So I'll write a kind of a blog around this. How do you set up, and how do you, maybe I'll pick one of this identity provider. Maybe I'll pick Okta because we use Okta in our org, right? So I actually got a developer account on Okta, and then I'll try to configure that and then write a blog around it. So that's in terms of an operator. And then you also have a developer dashboard. So in a developer, right, like as a developer, what I have is from a developer point of view, if I have to log me off. So let me log back in. Go to channel, page, services, single sign-on, manage. So here, right, so this is the developer dashboard that I'm looking at. So essentially what I have done, I created two different resources. So first one was the menu itself. So within menu, I have read and write access. So that's that's two permissions that I have set for menu, as well as for order. Again, I have a read access as well as an admin access. So once I have set up those resources to my applications, what I had to do was within my menu service, I created scope. So I created a scope called menu.read and menu.write and order.admin and order.me. And when I looked at from an operator's dashboard, when I showed you the Frank Underwood, these are the scopes that I assigned to them. So depending on the user, the scopes that I assigned was from a developer creates these authorizations, and an operator assigns that to the users. So that's how you configure this. Initially, when you do this setup, right, so you have to have a admin client, and that's what here my account. So I have an I have all the admin rights. I have both the client admin read and everything. So as a super user, I have access to all of this. My scope extends to everything. So this is how you typically configure, right? So very simple to configure. It was a little tricky, but once you know, it is very straightforward. So to kind of wrap it up, right? So from a developer's point of view, I wanted to show you something. So a developer, right, who is building a Spring Boot application, so for him to start using this, all he has to do is in your Spring Boot application, he has to just use a annotation. In this case, he just have to say enable OAuth to SSO, and then the Spring Cloud SSO connector will auto configure the OAuth configuration for him. And then once you do that, you simply bind the app to the SSO service. The scope also, right? The developer, what he can do within the application, he can just say he can use a pre-authorization annotation which says OAuth has scope to do.read here, as I'm showing you in an example. So all he has to do that is one line of code, and then pretty much declare in the developer dashboard how he wants to configure those resources. So finally, I mean, this is how it looks in terms of, I mean, the Pivotal's SSO. So you have a user, uses the client, that's your application. We provide the authorization server as well as the identity provider. And then we talked about how the exchange happens through tokens. And the same concept extends to the APIs, microservices itself. APIs reach to the authorization servers, they get a token, and then pretty much they communicate. And we also support external legacy apps. So all you have to do is configure through SAML or OIDC and start using the identity provider. So for your legacy apps. So that's my last deck. I mean, the Pivotal SSO service, I mean, this is done using a tile. So it provides you this trusted on-demand connection between your cloud applications. It is available from the marketplace, and if I have to say that, I mean, it reinforces your innovation, right? So developers can now focus on code itself and not have to worry about the platform itself. That's all I have.
Tej, can you please go back to your slide number 11, please?
Sure.
So let's say we have an app running in Cloud Foundry, and I have, you know, it's a Spring Boot app. I used all those appropriate annotations, and I have bound it to a service that I created with my Pivotal SSO tile, right? Which is using some external identity provider. Okay. So can you like walk me through the flow? Then what will happen when a user request comes into that app? Exactly what's the authentication flow that is happening there?
Yeah, let's show. If I open a Cognito window, right? So
sure.
let's see. So my customer application is this customer portal. Let me copy that. So I'm trying to access this application. So customer portal 2.cfapps.io.
Correct.
Okay. So that's my microservice. I'm trying to access it. So the moment I hit that, right? So what it does is now that application sends me to the authorization server. So the authorization server has a login page. So this login page can be, I can have my own logo here, and I can set up a login page where I ask for user information. So I give the user information. In this case, I give Frank's username and password. So the moment I do that, right? So what this is doing.
So what was, in this particular case, what was the identity provider chosen then?
So the identity provider in this case is the UAA. So in our.
It's our own UAA server.
So this Frank, what he is doing is he's going here. Where is my dashboard? Let's open the dashboard. Okay, that's the developer dashboard. I'll show you the operator dashboard. So if I go here, right, operator dashboard. So my identity provider in this case is the internal user store.
Okay.
And internal users, if I look here, right, this Frank exists here. So that is what is happening. So when I actually go here, right, so when I enter Frank's username and password, now it validates that username and password. So that's my authorization server. UAA is my authorization server. It validates that, and then what it is doing is, if I look at the access token, it creates the authorization server that SSO is creating a token. It never gives out a username and password. So application and authorization server always, once your authentication has been established, they always talk using a token. And this token, you can actually set the limits, how long this token is valid itself. So that information also can be configured. So if I go back here, right? So when I was
a TTL, right?
Yeah. So if I look at my order service, so the token validity, I can set when it expires. So once my token, I get the token itself, right? Like the token itself has what information it has. It has the key attributes, username, email, password, and all that, and it has the signature. And then it has this scope that I have declared. So Frank only has menu read and order read.
Correct.
Okay. So that's pretty much the flow. That's how it happens. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure. Any other questions?